Welcome back. All right, I'm wearing Atlanta gear because yesterday Bill Daly stoked the fires just a little bit. You can kind of see how the NHL telegraphs these things. And right now it feels like there are four markets that the NHL is at least considering. Now, at the bottom of the board is an issue that needs to be cleared up first. You have to have the building in Arizona cleared up first, and that should be done in January. January, we should have an idea of where they're building it, what that's going to look like. It's probably going to look a lot like the Tempe Entertainment District was going to look. That's the plan, anyways. And so, with Arizona out there, it feels like the NHL can't look to expand until they've got a building for the Coyotes because you have to have that contingency plan just in case. So, just in case the whole thing in Arizona blows up and you don't have a place for them to play, you have to have a place for them to land. And Salt Lake City has kind of come out of nowhere to look like it might be the next market where the National Hockey League goes. That being said, there's a lot of telegraphing going here. So I want to talk about four markets. Why? Because if the NHL does decide to expand, I don't see them just going to 33 teams. And I know people are going to say it's too many teams, it's too many teams. And I get it, but at the same time, may I present to you money? So Houston's the number 7 US TV market, and the size of the market is part of the reason why they're still in Arizona. Phoenix is a very large market. If they can get that foothold, if they can get it to work, they can make a ton of money. And I know people are going to say, well, that's a big if. Right, but that's the gamble the NHL's been making for a lot of years in the desert now. Now, Houston, there's a gamble here too. Absolutely, it's a gamble here too. They've had the Houston Aeros. Houston has not always had the best of attendance when it comes to hockey, but hey, they haven't had a National Hockey League team. They did have a WHA team. It was pretty successful. Didn't quite make it into the National Hockey League. If it had, we might be having a different discussion. Now, by my guess, if you're going to expand by 4 teams, we'll talk about where guys go in which division. I'll talk about that after I talk about the size of the markets. Salt Lake City is a smaller market from TV market perspective, 29th in the United States. But they don't have a hockey team in Utah anywhere near the National Hockey League level. And so, can it work? I think it can. I absolutely think it can. And this is a market the National Hockey League hasn't had. So, that I think makes it an attractive option as well. Now, Atlanta, I'm pausing because there's going to be a lot of Atlanta, seriously. But yes, Atlanta is the number 6 U.S. television market, which is why the NHL might look at the situation, take a deep breath, and say, we're going to try it again. So Atlanta's had a couple of previous go-arounds, but it is the number 6 U.S. TV market. You can get teams in Atlanta and Houston, you're going to get more eyeballs on your product. Now, Quebec City, that is the number 7 Canadian TV market. You know what? I'll take the question mark off of that. I had the question mark up there initially. I thought, I don't know if I can justify Quebec City being on the board, but I can. So the number 7 Canadian TV market, and absolutely I think would get added. Why? Okay, so you're going to expand to Houston, Salt Lake City, and Atlanta. These are not traditional NHL markets. And I think adding another Canadian team is good. I think that's a good idea. And so I think Quebec City would be added as well. What this does is it means you can put a team in each division. So Houston would have to go into the Central. The Houston-Dallas rivalry is automatic. Salt Lake City then would have to go in the Pacific. And I say have to because, yes, you can move teams around. Maybe you put Salt Lake City in the Central and you move Arizona back to the Pacific, right? Arizona, I think, ideally would like to be in the Pacific, so maybe they end up in the Pacific. Salt Lake City goes into the Central Division, right? Atlanta has to go into the Metro because Quebec City has to be in the Atlantic. You can't even think about putting Quebec City in the Metro Division. You can't have them in a different division than Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. You just can't. And having all these new teams would definitely bring a lot of excitement to the National Hockey League and money. The expansion fee is expected to be near $1 billion should the NHL choose to expand again. I would think at least $750 million. So that's $3 billion to bring in 4 teams. And the kicker is, that is money that doesn't count as revenue. That is money that the National Hockey League keeps for itself. They do not share that with the players. This is part of the reason why the last CBA was negotiated, the NHL insisted on expansion money staying the way that it is, not counted as revenue. Why would you care? Why would you care if you weren't going to expand again? So the reality is that this could work. I absolutely think this can work. Atlanta currently has the Braves, the Falcons, the Hawks, and United FC. So you have to look at soccer as well. The Braves, of course, that's baseball. Not a lot of bleed over in schedules between baseball and hockey. The Falcons, obviously, there's going to be some crossover, but you only have to worry about 8 or 9 home dates because it's a 17-game season now in the NFL. And you have the Hawks. Now, the Hawks, this is absolutely a thing that can be a problem where you've got basketball, hockey at the same time. You have to make sure that you are, keeping that attendance up. But what really got this discussion started was John Daly saying the market has changed, that the demographics have changed, and he thinks it can work. We know that there's a stadium being built just outside of Atlanta with the idea that, hey, maybe if we get this built, we can attract the National Hockey League, and clearly the NHL's paying attention. We'll come back to Atlanta. Houston has the Astros, the Texans, the Rockets. Of course, that's NBA. To go with NHL and Major League Baseball, and they have Dynamo FC as well when it comes to the soccer side of things. So Houston has 4 teams, and I could see the argument being made that both Atlanta and Houston have a lot of different sports teams competing for that entertainment dollar. But again, I think it's a different fan base between the NBA and the NHL. We can look just in Canada here in Toronto, the NBA and the NHL, it thrives. Both of those teams thrive in terms of ticket sales, so I think it can work in Houston and Atlanta as well. It just has to be run correctly, right? Now, Salt Lake City has the Utah Jazz, so that's direct competition of sorts there because that's NBA. Again, how much crossover is there between basketball and hockey? And then they have Real Salt Lake for, again, Major League Soccer. I do think this can work in Salt Lake City. I really do. Quebec City doesn't have an NHL level, so Major League Sports level team. They do have the Quebec Remparts in the QMJHL, and they have drawn 14,000 or more to games. They've absolutely been able to do that. And in part, this shows that Quebec City is a very vibrant hockey market, but that's where the argument then comes in that it's a smaller market. There's already a lot of hockey fans there. Part of what you're doing by putting teams in Houston, Salt Lake City, and Atlanta is maybe making people fans of hockey who aren't fans of hockey right now and getting their dollars to support your NHL team. And it's been hit and miss. The NHL's been doing this forever. Since 1967 expansion, it's been about new markets, creating new fans, and new revenue streams. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't necessarily think they're done with trying to make this work. Now, Jazz owner Ryan Smith has been interested in buying a team. We know the NHL has met with him. We know the NHL has openly talked about Salt Lake City wanting a team. And anytime the NHL talks, you know this is all very measured. You know that if Bill Daly and Gary Bettman say anything publicly, it's a measured response. That there's certain topics they're not going to want to talk about and certain ones they are. And so to me, when they're talking about Salt Lake City, when they're talking about Atlanta, and when they've talked about Houston as well, and we know that they've met with the Houston Rockets owner, and he's expressed interest, and if you're going to make a team work in Houston, it has to be through the Houston Rockets as well. Because with the building as it is and everything, it's only going to work in Houston if Tillman is on basically the guy who's the owner of the team. So it is going to be interesting to see if 2 NBA owners buy into the National Hockey League and bring expansion their way. Again, this is where the Arizona question comes in, because while I do believe that Arizona is going to find a site to buy by January, in the event that they don't, the NHL can then reserve the right to say, we are going to take this team to Salt Lake City or Houston, right? And then that changes your expansion plans beyond that. But the NHL would much rather have expansion fees than a transfer fee, because your transfer fee to move a team from one city to the next is going to be much lower than your expansion fee. Why take $100 million in a transfer fee if you can stabilize a franchise and make sure it doesn't move, and then take a $750 million expansion fee from that same person? So Atlanta's had 2 NHL teams. The Atlanta Flames lasted from 72 to 80. They fell apart because there wasn't any excitement in the market. There wasn't really any playoff success either. Atlanta had a good team. The Atlanta Flames were a solid team. They just couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. They tried various marketing schemes to make it work, and it just didn't. The Atlanta Thrashers did draw. They absolutely did. They did draw. They didn't lose their team because fans didn't care. They didn't lose their team because nobody was going to games. And I've done videos pointing that out, where they weren't at the bottom of the league in terms of draw. They had poor ownership, and then they lost their building. They lost the lease on the building, and immediately the NHL was like, we have to go somewhere. And so they moved to Winnipeg, because Winnipeg had a building that was ready, and they had an owner with deep pockets who was willing to bail out the Atlanta Thrashers. So this is a situation where the NHL would have to get it right this time out. I think this is part of the reason why expansion is a much slower, more deliberate process now than it was in the 60s and into the 70s, as well as in the 90s. So in 67, you've got 6 teams in the NHL, and 7 years later, you've got 18 teams. Just picture that kind of level of expansion now. There would be a lot of arguing over how stupid it was, and I would be in agreement with that. And then you look at the 90s, you go from 21 teams in 1991 to 2000, where you have 30 teams. So, not 2,000 teams to 30 teams in 2000. You don't go from 21 to 2,000. NHL hasn't figured out 2,000 markets just yet. But it is something that I think the NHL would at least be foolish not to consider. And I understand the arguments for not wanting to see a 36-team league. I do think if we went to a 36-team league, we would see an expansion of the playoffs. We would see probably division winners get a bye into the next round. Something along those lines, right? And some kind of a play-in tournament as well, along the same lines as 2020, where you had the qualifying round and then you had the playoffs start, right? So we may see something like that, but Atlanta is clearly on the radar, and whether fans agree with it or not, whether other owners are like, wait, Atlanta, we've left Atlanta twice, whether they agree with it or not, we'll see, right? Because the fans, we can't stop an expansion, but the owners can. So if less than, I think it's just 2/3, you have to have 2/3 of the owners, I believe, to make the expansion work. I don't think it's a simple majority. But if Daly's out there and saying it can work, if Bettman isn't denying that it can work, then that means that probably, in all likelihood, privately, owners are saying, we can try Atlanta again. Then if it doesn't work, well, you can move another team to Canada, because Atlanta moved to Calgary. The Thrashers moved to Winnipeg, so maybe that's a backdoor to get Quebec City back, right? So there's that. But Quebec City, when last I could find that Gary Bettman's asked about it, was January. And his answer was, we're not in expansion mode. Not, we're never going to expand again. Not, we're happy with 32 teams and we are not going to expand further. Didn't say that. Just, we're not in expansion mode right now. And stated that he would let Quebec know when they were going to be ready to expand again. So again, it's not, we would love to have Quebec City back, but at this point in time with 32 teams, unless somebody's ready to move, Quebec City is going to be out in the cold. Doesn't say that. And was sure to say that Jeff Molson, the Habs owner, would welcome a return of the Nordiques. Okay, so again, why make that specification? So clearly there's been some discussion of how Quebec City can work. It's not going to be easy for Quebec City, much like Salt Lake City, not as big of a market as Houston or Atlanta, and arguably as well not as big a market as Phoenix, right? So you have a smaller market. You know that you also have the Canadian dollar to contend with in Quebec City. But can it work? I think it can. And I think if the NHL does this, my guess is it would be 2 teams at a time. I would think you do one in the East and one in the West, and then the second in the East and in the West probably 2 years later would be my guess. My guess would be 2030 would be when you'd see the first expansion, and 2032 would be when you'd see the next. I don't expect it to be anytime soon, but I do think that with the way the NHL is talking about this, clearly there's something there, where either they are keeping their options open just in case, or they're saying, you know what, we can go past 32 teams. That magical line of 32 teams, I know that the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball haven't crossed it. Doesn't mean nobody will, right? There's been a lot of talk about the NBA expanding and how much that's going to cost. So if you want a team back in Vancouver, the cost of expansion is like 1.3 billion or something like that. Like it's too high. I can't see anybody doing that. But could I see an expansion fee of almost $1 billion? not scaring off owners in Quebec City, Atlanta, Salt Lake City, Houston, yeah, I could see that working. And then so we'll see whether or not Quebec City finds really solid ownership, because that's the other issue as well. You have to have the corporate dollars. You have to have big companies. It's something that the Daily mentioned about Atlanta. You've got some big companies now in Atlanta, and it feels like it's just a stronger market for sponsorship dollars. For you're gonna have your private suites where you make tons of money. It can work, and so we'll see. It doesn't mean it will work. It means it can. And so for the National Hockey League, I think that all the Atlanta talk is great. I think it's fun. It's fun to talk about. But in the bigger picture, to me, it says there's 4 teams. That there's 4 locations where the NHL could go. And we'll see whether or not that comes to pass. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Where would you like to see the National Hockey League expand? There are other markets outside of these 4 that I think could support it. Absolutely. But those are the 4 that to me are most likely at this point. And even if Quebec City is just to throw a bone to Canadian fans and, just to see, well, we'll see if this can work, I think it would be a nice gesture. I also think a team in Hamilton can work, but that's just me, and I know Buffalo and Toronto and all that. But if Quebec City can make that work, I think it'd be great to have the Battle of Quebec back. And I would have to become a Nordiques fan again. I don't know how this is going to work, but I would have to, because I love the Nordiques their entire time in Quebec and would love to see them come back. So that's me. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.